Hello and welcome to class. It's DBA710 and it's week 6 assignments. As you can see, we're back to our suit and tie and at the podium, so we're back from our virtual vacation. So this week we're going to be moving into a new area of leadership theories, and this will be dealing with global management and some of the new theories that are coming about because of that. Let's take a look at the readings first. As you can see, we have readings from different parts of the world. We have something from India and we have something from China. We also have some broader, more theory-based approaches to management theory development. So it's going to be kind of an interesting week. It will be obviously built upon the theories and research that we've already been reading about, but this kind of takes us up to the current time and looks to what the next step in management theories and leadership theories are going to be. You have 2 assignments for this week. You have a discussion post related to the global management theories and practices that we'll be reading about. And then you also have a paper which is going to combine this week and last week's theories and readings to kind of show again the evolution of management, where we've come from and where we're going to. And again, I think this kind of brings us up to current times, so it should be an interesting paper to work on. So there's our discussion question, and there is our paper assignment. Now, before we get any further into this, the assignment question from last week dealt with the idea of variables, and I wanted you to look at a particular article to see if you could identify the dependent and independent variables. And there's a reason behind this, and that's because in writing a dissertation, and this is the type of approach that we're using here at the business program at Kaiser, and you'll find this true in, I would say, the majority of universities with a doctoral program. They have what we call a 5-chapter dissertation. The first chapter is an introduction to your research topic. The second chapter is a literature review, and here we're using the requirement that you need to have at least 2 literature streams as part of your dissertation. You can have more, but 2 is the minimum. Chapter 3 deals with describing the methodology that you plan to use for your own research. Then Chapter 4, you report the results, and Chapter 5 is a summary of the findings and conclusions that you could make from the findings that you got. Okay, so this is a basic outline, the framework of a 5-chapter dissertation, and this is basically what you'll be doing when you get into your dissertation mode. So what I want to talk about today is the methodology. We have been exploring literature, and that would be your Chapter 2, but today we want to look at methodology. Methodology involves identifying the variables that you plan to look at, and then explaining how the variables will be measured, what type of instruments you're going to be using, how the data will be collected, whether it's going to be through observation or surveys or experiments, how you're going to collect the data, what method of analysis will be performed on the data, and finally what sort of assumptions need to be made concerning extraneous variables and controlling for outside environmental effects that might corrupt the results that you're explaining. Okay, so methodology, the methodology chapter of your dissertation generally deals with these issues. So what I wanted to get at early on was the idea of different types of variables that normally are used. And we have independent variables, dependent variables, and extraneous variables. Independent variables are those things that you're looking at which will fluctuate, which would change, and they would cause a change in the dependent variable. Okay, so in a simple sort of high school type of experiment, you might experiment on different levels of lighting on how fast a plant might grow. For example, you might give one plant 8 hours of lighting and another plant 6 hours of lighting, and then you would see which plant grew faster. Lighting would be the independent variable because that was something you were changing, you were modifying. The size of the plant would be the dependent variable, and that would be measuring to see the effect of light and how much light on the growth of a plant. Well, we do the same thing when we're looking at management and leadership things. We're looking for, if we look at the contingency theories, contingency theories say there are independent variables that will cause the dependent variable to change. And the assignment that we were looking at, the paper we were looking at, was looking at some independent variables to see whether they had an effect on the dependent variable. Then we have other things that are called extraneous variables. These are things that we probably wish didn't exist, but sometimes we just can't get rid of. There's no way to account for them, so we just have to make assumptions about how these extraneous variables might influence the independent and dependent variables, the things that we are interested in. Okay, so in a controlled experiment, we eliminate as many extraneous variables as possible. For example, if we're going back to our example of using light in plants, if you had no control over the temperature, you might say that the temperature would be an extraneous variable. But if you could control the temperature for both plants, then you would say, well, I've taken control over that, or I've eliminated that as a possible confounding effect in my experiment, and so we're just looking at lights, the effect of lights. So let's take it the next step. Let's go and look at the actual article that you're going to be dealing with. Now, this was coming from the paper, A Contingency Theory of Organization Re-examined in the Context of a Developing Country. And what I asked you to do was identify the variables. Well, in the paper itself, there's a section that says variables. It says one of the variables is the degree of market competition. Okay, and the authors decided they would use these measures of market competition: the degree of price competition, degree of delay in securing a product, number of alternatives. So are these the only three things they could have used? No, but they decided this is how they were going to define the degree of market competition. Is market competition in their study a dependent or a independent variable? Well, it's hard to tell until we get to the study itself and look at it. But this is one variable. The other variable, or one more variable, was the decentralization in decision making. And here they came up with 9 different measures that they were going to use to try to identify the level of decentralization. Okay, so this is a second variable. And then the third variable was the organizational effectiveness. Okay, and they decided they were going to use 6 behavioral measures. Okay, and then a set of economic indicators, financial measures, and then they would break down the effects in terms of, whether people were happy or not, whether they had satisfaction in their work. But then they were also going to look at the financial performance of the organization. Okay, so we had 3 variables identified, and then the data was compiled, and this is simply a listing of the 30 companies that were involved in the study, and you can see they're broken down on market conditions. So the first, I think it's 14 companies fell into the category of highly competitive. The next 5 or 6 were considered moderately competitive, and the rest of them fell into the non-competitive. Okay, and you can see that the firms, it could be the company names, in this case they just assigned them random numbers, are given here which ones fell into those categories. Then, so those are the firms, those are the data points. The market conditions, that was one of the variables, and they broke it down into 3 separate categories. And then the next variable was the decentralization index. Here they broke it down into a ranking system. And then the next variable was the organizational effectiveness, and they broke this down into 2 separate categories of behavioral and economic. Well, again, from this we really still can't tell which are the independent and dependent variables. Everything is listed. This is all the information that their measures gave them. But it's not until we look at table number 2 to see how they organize their study and how they're presenting their information that it seems to make sense that the degree of centralization was one of the independent variables. The market conditions was the other independent variable. So in this case we have 2 independent variables. each broken down into 3 categories, which gave us a 3x3 table or matrix, however you want to look at it. And then the numbers inside each one of these categories, for example, a high degree of decentralization in a highly competitive market condition showed effectiveness being ranked at 1.32 on behavioral measures and 1.0 on financial measures. So here we have a study, an analysis that is using 2 independent variables and 1 dependent variable that's been broken down into 2 separate categories. Were there any other variables? Well, they did mention in the study that they tried to control for organization size, and they had a particular method of trying to deal with that to eliminate the effect that organizational size might have on the study. So one might consider that to be an extraneous variable. And then they also mentioned that part of the purpose of the study was that they were interested in seeing whether the contingency theory worked within a developing country, whether the Lawrence and Lorsch model was really compatible with a country in an earlier development stage. And they really didn't address that too clearly in the study, the part of the study that we saw here. And part of the reason for that is this study, the paper that we saw, was just one part of a much larger study, and the data that they pulled out to present in this paper was data that was compiled as part of a larger study. So I would suspect that if you searched on the authors of this study, you'd find that there was more papers published regarding other aspects of the particular study. So one might say, well, they didn't really address the contingency theory applied in India as opposed to, say, in England or the US or some more developed country. They really didn't address that issue, and you thought from reading the name of the article, the title, and then reading some of the introductory material, you would think, well, that would be part of what they were going to explain. But if you look at the study itself and the data that they presented, it didn't actually deal with that explicitly. They weren't comparing one country and another country. It was all within a particular country and the companies within that country. Okay? Could it have been done differently? Could the variables have been reversed? Well, possibly. If they had set up the study differently, you might see that organizational effectiveness, the measures of organizational effectiveness, could possibly be seen as a independent variable, okay, and their effect on something else, like the degree of decentralization. But in this particular study, the way that it was set up, it's clear that the market conditions and the degree of decentralization were the independent variables showing an effect on organizational effectiveness. Okay, looking ahead, we're going to have a paper coming up in week number 7, and this is going to actually deal more specifically with what I've just been talking about, the idea that we can propose theories, but in some sense we've got to be able to prove whether the theories are correct or not. And generally that means going out and collecting some data, doing an analysis, and then presenting it as this seems to prove or seems to support this particular theory, or based on this evidence it doesn't seem to support that theory. So I think you'll find week number 7 in the readings there will be very compatible with the discussion of independent and dependent variables. And as I said, as introducing this, it's important for you to start thinking in terms of variables and in terms of data that you might collect, because this will become an important component of your dissertation. Keys to success. Well, I think you're pretty well ingrained with what we need to do to be successful in this class, but let's see what our management expert Wally from the cartoon Dilbert seems to say. So, use feedback in your discussions and on your papers, and look for ways to improve. Even if I haven't said something, even if I haven't indicated here's a way to improve, look for ways to improve yourself. Okay, until next time, Goodbye and good luck.